Our roadmap for learning macroeconomics. Welcome and greetings. My name is Michael Niemeyer, and I will be your instructor for this course on the principles of macroeconomics. This journey into macroeconomics is based on my experience working for various financial institutions that rely upon macroeconomic data and insights. To that end, I will take you on the real-world road to understand macroeconomic data, to use basic macroeconomic tools, and to be able to interpret macroeconomic theories. Buckle up, and let's begin this journey with a map of the road ahead. This course will use the textbook entitled Practical Macroeconomics for Non-Economists, which will provide you with the building blocks, which are the economic tools, theory, and empirical foundations, to understand the subject. This macroeconomics textbook and the lectures are structured around a question and answer format. An article in the Teacher's Digest suggests that questions help learning. But, more poetically, Rudyard Kipling may have said it best in his Just So stories. Kipling wrote that, "I keep 6 honest serving men, they taught me all I knew. Their names are what and where and when and how and why and who." Before we begin, it is important that you understand why our focus will be on what is termed practical macroeconomics. The term practical macroeconomics largely describes what is considered settled or consensus thinking in macroeconomics. As such, throughout this course you will encounter each of these practical macroeconomic principles with discussions about key statistics, main channels of influence on the economy, or key stories about how the economy operates. Therefore, let's set forth these principles, which serve as our course foundation. The textbook's title in this course's focus on practical macroeconomics has a common meaning and a subject meaning. The common meaning is that this course will try to provide you with a real-world understanding of how the economy operates. The subject meaning, however, is about the core principles of macroeconomics. Stanford University professor John Taylor set out the core principles of practical macroeconomics in a May 1997 paper entitled A Core of Practical Macroeconomics, and those principles still ring true today. Taylor opined that practical macroeconomics was built upon 5 principles that you will discover in the textbook and this course. Those practical macroeconomics principles are: 1. Labor productivity depends on the growth in capital, labor, and technology, which is tied to the aggregate production function. Moreover, labor productivity added to labor force growth equals long-term growth or potential output. This is the foundation for gap models. This first principle connects how we measure productivity or the efficiency of the production process with the idea of the aggregate production function, and goes one step further to compare actual output with some empirical estimate of potential output for the economy. Of course, we will unpack, so to speak, these elements of practical macroeconomics as we move through the course material. 2. There is no long-term trade-off between inflation and the unemployment rate, implying that a central bank, which expands the money supply too much, will simply produce more inflation without affecting the unemployment rate. 3. There is a short-run trade-off between inflation and the unemployment rate. 4. The public's expectations are highly responsive to policy. 5. Even one-time changes in monetary and fiscal policy have a multi-period impact on the economy. Keep in mind that each of these principles embodies relational ideas about how the economy works. It may be the relationship between actual and potential output, short-term or long-term inflation and unemployment, expectations and actions, and today's policy decisions having tomorrow's lingering impact. As a starting point, keep in mind that macroeconomics is about setting goals and trying to achieve them. As simple as that is, it is the foundation of what macroeconomics is all about. True, those goals evolve over time and should, but the basic approach remains the same, trying to reach some macroeconomic goal. Again, all of these issues will be unpacked throughout this course. However, I strongly recommend that you never lose sight of these 5 principles that encompass our basic understanding of how the economy operates today. With this said, Also keep in mind that macroeconomic institutions are evolving, macroeconomic statistics are broadening, and macroeconomic relationships are evolving, which will mean, in time, these principles may be modified for tomorrow's insights. So let's now consider the structure of this course. The way to think about this textbook and this class is that the textbook is about imparting information. The classroom or online learning environment is about testing knowledge and discussing ideas. The homework assignments are about the application of concepts. You will find that the first 12 chapters of the book, A, and D, consequently these lectures, are around the core competencies that are required of an introductory macroeconomics course. However, there are a number of aspects of this book and course that largely go beyond the core competencies. 1. There is an attempt to show different theories and how proponents would implement different policies as well. 2. There are advanced questions in the textbook that may be skipped without any loss of subject matter continuity. But sometimes those advanced questions may provide the answers to follow-on questions, even though they may not be essential. 3. The focus of the book and course presentation is heavily literary exposition to offer the macroeconomic story without the math or statistics. However, there is a discussion of basic exploratory data analysis techniques, which are important to tell those macroeconomic stories. 4. Every attempt has been made to include topics, sources, and issues that are discussed on Wall Street, in the halls of the Congress, and in the boardrooms of central banks and corporations. This also means that you will find topics that are not usually included in an introduction to macroeconomics, such as how the non-bank financial intermediation sector has changed the financial landscape, what is central bank digital currency, or how asset inflation is related to commodity inflation, and much more. 5. The core paradigm of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply is presented in a more unique and applied fashion. Everyone can use actual data to develop an aggregate demand and aggregate supply model for a point in time or multiple points. Although the mechanics are simple to apply, it requires reaching to some non-standard research on elasticity of aggregate demand and aggregate supply to make it applicable. But in applying these tools for the aggregate demand/aggregate supply model, understand that it is not so much about the graphic presentation, but the stories that are told from and around the model. 6. The issues topics in Part 2 of the textbook are optional for this course. Some may be more relevant than others at different times, but they include some issues of day, such as the disappearing U.S. worker or the global debt explosion, and some issues core to macroeconomics, such as uncertainty. We will touch on some of those issues, if time permits. The final chapter in the textbook raises the question about what the future of macroeconomics will be, and how will it be reshaped. This is an important topic that will be used to wrap up the course. Okay, with this overview, let's discuss the approach used in this course. In the opening of UCLA Professor Edward Lamer's 2009 Macroeconomics book on patterns and stories, he admitted that his subject and focus was inspired by a National Public Radio, NPR, commentator that he was listening to who observed, human beings are pattern-seeking, storytelling animals. Indeed, Lamer thought that NPR observation exactly described what economists do and even added in a footnote that once indoctrinated in graduate school, it takes a long time for new PhDs in economics to learn that it is only stories and patterns that we do. Long before I read Lamer's comment, about 30 years before his book, I worked for an economist whose department policy was that you could use all the econometrics you wanted to understand an issue, but never report those results to the readers, only tell the story what the analysis suggested. Later, an economist, whom I had previously worked with, was reflecting on his experience of routinely making economic presentations to the senior-most echelon of a major New York City bank. He told me that we are all storytellers. I chuckled a bit at that, but he was, of course, correct. I have embraced that thought ever since. Economics is about telling stories. You can have the most insightful analysis and brilliantly prescient forecast about the economy, but if you cannot tell a convincing story to others to believe it, then it is all for naught. Indeed, I witnessed this in the late 1970s when consumer inflation was running at a double-digit pace and the chief economist of a major brokerage was forecasting that inflation would ease dramatically to about 4% in the next 3 to 4 years. Few believed that forecast and he ultimately was replaced, but he turned out, in hindsight, to have had a correct view of where inflation was headed. Unfortunately, he did not have a convincing story for that forecast. Stories matter in economics. Stories matter especially in introductions to macroeconomics. No one expects a novice to the field to understand the mathematical formulations of theories or the econometric estimations of issues without first understanding the economic stories and patterns of the data. An opinion piece by Gillian Tett, which appeared in the Financial Times on August 26, 2022, was entitled, "Economists Shouldn't Underestimate the Power of a Good Story." The subtitle opined that narrative matters at least as much as models. Of course, I heartily agree, which is the premise of this course. Keep that in mind as you progress through this course. Finally, let's just summarize the goals, objectives, and perspective of this course. 1. This course is a survey of the macroeconomic landscape and institutions, mainly for the United States. 2. You will learn about the key concepts and objectives for the macroeconomy, largely based on what is known as the narrative approach. 3. Every attempt has been made to highlight actual economic data patterns. 4. Throughout the course there will be opportunities for you to get your hands dirty with actual economic statistics to understand what these data measure and how they are put together. 5. Every attempt will be made to share current policy thinking as embraced by the Federal Reserve Board, the Congressional Budget Office, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and other international organizations. 6. It is my hope that you come away with a broad understanding of how the economy is presumed to work, which is an evolving story, why policymakers craft policies as they do based on economic objectives, and what are the issues facing the macroeconomy today. With this perspective, let's explore practical macroeconomics. However, before we begin our discussion of macroeconomics, we need some prerequisites. Those prerequisites are a basic introduction to demand and supply, which is the foundation of microeconomics, not macroeconomics, per se. This introduction is useful for a couple of reasons. First, if you have not taken a microeconomics course, then you need to know the basic mechanics of supply and demand, which is used in the discussion of labor markets and commodity markets at the macro level. Additionally, it is helpful as a conceptual contrast to how the aggregate demand and aggregate supply is structured. Next, it is important that you have a basic understanding how to graph and interpret patterns in economic data. There is an introduction to this topic, as well. 2 additional topics are part of the prerequisites, which are accessing and using free economic databases. Although these consolidated databases may not include all the available economic statistics from public and private sources, they serve a very useful service for looking at the current or real-time patterns of data that cannot be assessed in real time from published textbooks. So, let's first look at the microeconomic concepts of supply and demand.